What's popping? What's cracking? What's going on? What's up? I want to talk about the PBD podcast. I don't know what the PBD stands for, but it's the image here. It's in the thumbnail, with David Pakman. I don't remember the guy's name from the PBD podcast because I don't watch that podcast. I have watched a lot of Pac-Man in the past. I do call him Pac-Man instead of David. That's just going to happen the whole time. But PBD guys seem to not understand the differences between debt across different levels, like as an individual, a business, or a government, right? And I want to set aside the fact that this was not a very. I think it was a good conversation and a bad conversation. Like, it's necessary to have conflicting viewpoints, and I think most people view things the way that the PBD guy does. Like, everybody that I've talked to that either doesn't understand economics or just passed, even if they're like an economics major at a point and they just use it as an excuse to get another field. I've heard them say similar things. Like, here's things that you should understandably think. You should think debt is bad, reasonably. Most people in society think having debt is a bad thing, right? But like, most economists would be like, well, there's a context in the situation when debt is bad. Like, debt can be useful, right? Understand? I mean, obviously, even in a personal setting, right? If you've had no debt ever, then you've never paid off any debt ever, right? And then you don't have a decent credit history. Like, you should, like, being in debt is bad for a person, obviously, right? But if we look at like some of the biggest economic booms that have happened, let's say after 2008, right, with like the tech industry, subsisting purely on debt. Right. I mean, I do Uber driving right now. Right. So much from my economics degree that helped me a lot. Right. No, business degree. But like, Uber is a company that just wasn't profitable for so long. The Uber Eats portion was profitable, I think, 2 years. I don't know if it's been profitable in the last two, but like, I believe there was 2 profitable years. But the major overall Uber company wasn't profitable. Amazon wasn't profitable multiple different years. I think they've reached profitability in some areas. So many aspects of business just don't make money. Right. And I think that's understandably, like, that's insane for someone to be like, how can, like, if you're in debt, that's bad? Because I think we put our own personal experience and understanding with that and we place that onto it. When they're talking, Pac-Man's trying to explain pretty reasonably that, like, here, like, debt is bad because of one obvious. He says this pretty reasonably thing. Debt sucks for you because at one point you have to pay that debt off, and if you can't, you're evicted, right? You go to jail, right? You get your corporate. I have some debts that I have to pay off that suck a lot, right? Had I not incurred those debts, things would have been great. But had things went differently for me, the reason I incurred those debts was strategic. There's a point that things just didn't go as planned. But Pac-Man makes a really good point. Like, because you have to, there's a cutoff point. Because you eventually you run out of money and you have to pay a point back. That happens with businesses too, but the point is drastically different, right? Like, when you have to pay off your debt is drastically, even when it's court ordered. Like, what happens to a business that's in debt? It's crazy. I mean, businesses just end up purchasing other businesses. They take on their debt. They repurpose, restructure, sell product. Like, there's a lot of bad things happen when a company is in debt for too long. Don't get me wrong. But often there's some way to salvage or change things. And along the way, profitable things are taking place, I think. And with the government, it's even more so unique, right? Because there's always people to tax, right? But again, like, there isn't a point where the government is evicting itself. The cutoff point for a government isn't explicitly because of the debt, right? In a global sense, there can be a global economic crisis that'll happen, and that would be like the true cutoff point. But prior to that, it would be like an uprising, sort of. But that's not necessarily a debt-based thing. That's a disappointing your constituents, right? But like, again, that doesn't happen at the same. It's not because here's when you need to pay us back type of thing, right? That, like, they're the ones handing out the loans, right? Like, banks that go into, like, global banks, and banks have very different rules for debt than people. It should just be understood that you're operating on different rules because of scale. I mean, really, it's scale is the major thing. That's, as soon as you scale up, things change drastically. what you can do with $10 is very different than what you can do with $1,000. What you can do when owed $1,000 is different than what you can do when owed $10, right? Like let's say $100. Even I want to bring this down to a regular scale. I don't want to make an economics lesson because I'm not an economics professor, but you're here, so I guess I'll try and explain it in a way, because I think there's an issue with understanding why it's like PBD dude seem not to understand how it could not necessarily have to be a bad thing that we have debt, or how debt can be useful. Let's use it in a small sense, right? Pakman used a car example. Like, oh, did Pakman use the example? No, I was watching IRA stream reacting to it, so IRA made an example. So let's not even use him. Let's say you have no money, but you have a family, right? Or even you have a family. It's you and one child, just one child. You need to find a way to get some form of income, right? It's like, okay, so I take a loan out for $8,000. You're going to use this loan to maybe get a car. Maybe hopefully you can get a car for less than for like a really bad car for like $5,000 or something, right? I know I got a car for $5,000. It was decent, very different time now, right? And maybe the rest of that money is used to pay a little bit of your bills, a little bit of your rent. Maybe you don't use it at all. Maybe you already have a car. Maybe you use that money to just pay for food, heating, water. Maybe you make it so that you don't have to work in excess of hours so that you can be studying. You're applying to jobs. You're doing a series of things that could potentially increase your income, but you wouldn't have access to doing those things without the loan of $8,000, right? Say your rent, you live in a studio apartment and you're paying like $1,300, not a studio, but whatever apartment fits your family, you're paying like $1,300 a month. Okay, maybe you're making only $2,000 a month. So your take home after your groceries is nothing, right? But if you have that $8,000 loan, right, maybe on top of that, I'm like, okay, something, you can get stuff for your kids, you get some shoes, books, you're getting certain things you need to just keep the process going. And I think that's the key point. You're keeping things going in the meantime. Because without any money, everything just has to stop. Necessarily things have to stop. Like, you need money to function or survive. Now, the other interesting thing is, absent, say you get evicted, say your kids leave, say say a bunch of things can happen to you where you actually become less productive than you previously would have been. Maybe you need let's not even go crazy with the example. You stop being able to afford food. You're no longer able to live. You're no longer working a job that the business pays taxes and you pay taxes. You're contributing less back to society or whatnot. It really could be simple as that. If you don't care about the life of the child and wife, of course. Hopefully the wife also is getting a job. Maybe in the meantime, that money could be used to pay for either a reasonable schooling, a babysitter. You could immediately start getting a babysitter, so their mother could be looking for a job too, and you're doubling the income. Over the time of that loan, assuming nothing else happens, that $8,000 was worth a lot more than $8,000. It helped the security of you knew that you were going to be living at home. You knew that you were going to be taking care of your child. You knew that you were going to be, warm and fed. All these things have a value that's kind of more than the money that it's worth, right? It's kind of because there are certain things that are invaluable, right? Like, there's an upper limit to how much most people will pay for food, comfort, and not an upper limit, right? Like, I don't care to pay $1 million to live in somewhere because it's only so useful to me, right? After that threshold, like, there's like here to here in which it becomes more useful, and then it doesn't really matter. And it's kind of the case with food. I can only eat so much food. I can only be, there's certain things that you need, or like even health related things, right? Like, maybe I don't feel the greatest, maybe I have a flu, like, I'll get some extra medicine, but I'm not gonna go to in the ER for it. But there's that lower level in which, like, if you don't have these things, it's game over, right? Like you need to have at least the minimum amount of food, you need a minimum amount of shelter, you need a minimum amount of health to function at all, and you need to at least those things being covered to do anything else with your money. And I think that's one of that. I think this explanation probably was more complicated than it needed to be, but I just really wanted to get a bunch of examples in of real things, which I think have value. Like I could just probably put up some numbers and equations to the value of debt and what it turns into. But you could also, I mean, if you really wanted, you should just Google like the value of social welfare programs, right? Like public schooling, like free public schooling it's a social welfare. It's socialist, right? There's nothing more socialist than like, hey, we're going to take money from you guys. We're going to use that money and we're going to decide what we do with it. And what we want to do with it, part of it is make your sorry, one sec. All right. We're gonna make your kids go to school. Like it's not up to you. Your kids have to go to school. You can choose to make them go to a better school somewhere else, or maybe you can homeschool them, I suppose, but there's still requirements that has to happen. But like we're taking your money, and that's just gonna have to happen. But the benefit of everyone going at least to like the more school that people go to, the more productive they are in society, right? Even learning things that you don't think are important. What classes do people not like? I have a hard time finding classes that are important, like advanced mathematics. I think maybe not advanced math, just math that you'll do in high school. It's actually a lot more useful for a lot more jobs than you think, and how often you might be using something like algebra in obviously if you're doing any type of accounting or whatnot, but any work. Anytime you're using numbers at work, adding algebra to it makes you a lot more effective, and you can come to much quicker decisions. If you're a business owner, especially. But I mean, there's an endless amount of jobs that having increased math skills just makes you better at problem solving in general. And again, when you're doing math, like word problems as well, right? Because you're not just looking at numbers and solving numbers, you're finding ways to apply numbers to real life situations. That makes it useful. Understand history, like you have to you're a more informed voter if you understand history. Having social just studies classes in general, understanding politics is very necessary, so you know what reforms have worked in the past, what will work, what the general policies. Understanding science, very necessary, right? People's misunderstanding of vaccines it's their lack of paying attention to just basic science classes. I mean, so many things that I've learned in just high school, not even in college, have been so immensely useful to just understanding how the world works, right? And again, that's part of schooling that my family was poor. If there wasn't public schooling, I just wouldn't have went to school. That just would have been it. We just would have, my parents would have tried their best to homeschool me, but how much would they likely have known if they didn't go to public school when they grew up? My dad might have went to a private school, actually, and I think my dad went to a private high school. I went to a private elementary school for a little until we moved. But again, like that's a socialist policy that has these, and I'm just talking about the general use of it. You could just look at there's just studies of how well people drop out on average, how well they perform. The difference between even being a dropout at a senior versus a freshman is drastically different. Now again, that also includes the context of the type of person that's going to drop out and why you're dropping out on average. The context is already pretty bad. You're not pulling from great areas. A lot of inner city kids dropping out, like their prospects weren't that great in the first place. Their prospects were better had they finished. They're more likely to get certain jobs, even a job at service jobs. You're probably more likely to do better in a service job finishing high school than having not done so. I mean, getting a GED, immensely useful too. It's like again, I would be described as a social democrat likely. There's probably specific policies you could get me on where I'd be closer to like a lefty or maybe even socialist, right? I think a lot of social democrats like the idea of a paid as like healthcare being completely either completely paid for or just some levels of it, some basic things, right? Because it's a burden to have people that could have had a paid for healthcare, like things we already end up paying the amount. So Pakman said this, like we already are losing and paying this money by people going to the emergency room, which is even more expensive. And if we had a minimum healthcare system that we, allocated that same amount of money for, it actually would be more effective. And it would waste less of the time that people that need to go to the emergency room. I grew up poor. My family exclusively went to the emergency room every time something is wrong. And I did not understand that. We'd like, wait, nothing happened. Oh, somebody fainted, bring them to the emergency room. But if we had some form of regular physician that we're going to regularly, you'd understand what's taking place. Also, you get misdiagnosed so frequently at the emergency room because they're trying to fix emergencies. Which is often my family would go hey, we went to the doctors and they didn't know what to do. I'm like, okay, but they're not even looking for the things that you actually need to be looking for. At a point, it's are you dying right now or going to be dying soon? Are you having a health emergency right now? Or is there some underlying condition that we need to be looking for? The hospital system's not going to be perfect even with this fix, but it's going to be much better without it. I'm rambling a lot now. Again, it's a couple of things. I might end up making a series of videos talking about different common misunderstandings of just subtle parts of economics, which have very, very major issues with how people view, politics and whatnot, especially debt. I'll probably have to do another video on debt, talking about in more detail how government debt works. But I think that's enough for now. But like what you saw, leave a like, do a subscribe, do a crime. Just kidding, don't do a crime, and I'm out.